The silence woke him. Cormac Whelan's eyes snapped open in the pre-dawn darkness, his weathered hands instinctively reaching for the rifle beside his bedroll. After 30 years of sleeping under open skies, he knew the difference between peaceful quiet and the unnatural hush that followed disaster. The storm that had raged through the night of February blizzard that howled like banshees across the Montana wilderness had passed, leaving behind an eerie stillness that made his skin crawl. He pushed himself upright, joints protesting against the cold that had seeped through his heavy coat and wool blankets. The fire he'd banked before sleep had died to gray ash, and his breath formed crystalline clouds in the frigid air. Snow had drifted against the rocky outcropping where he'd taken shelter, creating a natural windbreak that had likely saved his life. But something was wrong. Cormac's pale blue eyes scanned the small clearing where he'd made camp, searching for the familiar silhouette of his horse. The spot where he'd picketed Maverick the night before, a flat area protected by towering pines, was empty save for disturbed snow and the remnants of hay he'd scattered for the stallion's dinner. Maverick, his voice cracked through the morning air, rough from sleep and cold. No answering whinny came from the surrounding forest. No familiar stamp of hooves or gentle snorting that had greeted him every morning. For the past 8 years, the cowboy's boots crunched through knee-deep snow as he approached where his horse should have been. The picket stake stood empty, the leather lead rope nowhere to be seen. But it was what lay in the snow around the stake that made his blood run cold. Footprints. Human footprints. Cormac dropped to one knee, his experienced eye reading the story, written in the white powder. The prints were large size 12 boots, at least with a distinctive wear pattern on the left heel. Whoever had been here moved with purpose, approaching the horse from downwind to avoid spooking him. The prints led away from camp in a straight line toward the northwest, disappearing into the dense timber that cloaked the mountainside. But these weren't the footprints of a desperate traveler seeking help. The stride was too confident, too measured. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Son of a bitch, Cormac muttered, his jaw clenching. In all his years working cattle drives and hunting in the backcountry, he'd never had a horse stolen from right under his nose. The fact that he'd slept through it, storm or no storm, gnawed at him like a physical ache. Maverick wasn't just transportation. The copper-colored Mustang with the white blaze was his partner, his companion through countless lonely nights and dangerous days. They'd weathered stampedes together, outrun wolves, and navigated treacherous mountain passes that would have claimed lesser pairs. The horse had an uncanny ability to sense danger and had saved Cormac's life more times than he could count. Now someone had taken him. The cowboy's weathered face hardened as he studied the tracks more carefully. Mixed in with the boot prints were Maverick's distinctive hoof prints. The right front shoe had a small chip that created a unique mark in mud or snow. The horse hadn't fought or struggled. The prints suggested he'd followed willingly, which meant the thief knew how to handle horses. That narrowed the possibilities considerably. Cormac worked with methodical efficiency, breaking camp with the speed of a man who'd done it 1,000 times before. He rolled his bedding tight, secured his gear, and shouldered his pack, all while his mind calculated distances and possibilities. The storm had ended perhaps 3 hours ago. Judging by the settled snow, the thief had a significant head start. But tracks this clear wouldn't last long if the weather turned. He pulled his battered Stetson low over his eyes and began following the trail northwest, his long strides eating up the distance despite the challenging terrain. The prints led him through a maze of deadfall and rocky outcroppings, winding higher into the mountains with each mile. Whoever had taken Maverick knew this country well. The route avoided the worst of the steep grades, while maintaining a steady climb toward the high passes. The sun climbed higher, and Cormac paused frequently to study the tracks. The story they told grew more interesting with each mile. The thief had stopped twice, once to adjust something on the horse, and once to rest. Both stops had been brief and purposeful. This wasn't some opportunistic drifter who'd stumbled across an unguarded horse. This was planned. By midday, the trail led him to a narrow canyon carved by an ancient glacier. The walls rose steeply on both sides, creating a natural corridor that funneled toward a pass visible in the distance. Here, the snow was less deep, protected by overhanging rocks, and Cormac could see more details in the prints. The boot treads were clearer, now military-style combat boots with a distinctive lug sole. The wear pattern suggested someone who favored his left leg slightly, possibly from an old injury. But it was what he found at the third rest stop that made him pause. A cigarette butt, only half smoked, ground into the snow beside a flat boulder. The paper was high quality, hand-rolled, and the tobacco was expensive Turkish blend by the smell. Cormac carefully wrapped it in his bandana and tucked it into his vest pocket. In a territory where most men smoked cheap store-bought cigarettes or chewed tobacco, this was a significant clue. The trail continued deeper into the canyon, but Cormac's instincts began prickling with unease. The narrow walls created perfect spots for an ambush, and a man who would steal a horse in a blizzard wouldn't hesitate to eliminate a pursuer. He unslung his Winchester and jacked around into the chamber, his eyes constantly scanning the rim. Rock above, the canyon curved sharply to the left, and as Cormac rounded the bend, he stopped dead in his tracks. 50 yards ahead, the trail split into 3 distinct paths, one following the main canyon toward the pass, one climbing steeply up the left wall via a series of rocky ledges, and one descending toward what looked like a hidden valley to the right. All 3 paths showed signs of recent passage. The cowboy's jaw tightened as he studied the ground more carefully. The clever bastard had backtracked, using the rocky ground to mask his true direction. But Maverick's hoofprints were harder to disguise than boot prints, and Cormac's trained eye picked out the subtle differences in the tracks. 2 of the paths showed only boot prints. The thief had walked them deliberately to create false trails, but the path descending toward the hidden valley showed the deeper impressions of a man leading a horse, with small scuff marks where Maverick had occasionally balked at the uncertain footing. That was the true trail. As Cormac began the descent toward the valley, a new sound reached his ears, the distant ring of steel on stone, echoing off the canyon walls. Someone was down there, and they were working with metal tools. The sound came in irregular bursts, too random for regular blacksmith work, but too purposeful for casual repair. The cowboy's grip tightened on his rifle as a grim possibility occurred to him. Horse thieves in this territory had been known to rebrand stolen animals, changing their markings to make them harder to identify. If that was happening to Maverick, Cormac picked up his pace, moving as quietly as possible through the scattered rocks and sparse timber that dotted the valley floor. The valley opened before Cormac like a secret world carved from the mountain's heart. Steep walls encircled a natural amphitheater perhaps 2 miles across, with a frozen stream meandering through its center. Ancient pines dotted the landscape, their dark green branches heavy with snow, while scattered boulders the size of cabins created a maze of hiding spots and vantage points. But it was the thin column of smoke rising from the valley's far end that held his attention. Cormac dropped behind a cluster of wind-carved rocks and pulled out his field glasses, a battered pair of Zeiss binoculars he'd carried since his army days. Through the lenses, he could make out a crude but well-concealed camp nestled against the valley's western wall. A canvas lean-to stretched between 2 massive boulders, nearly invisible against the gray stone. A small fire burned in a ring of rocks, its smoke dissipating among the overhanging branches. And there, tethered near the fire, stood Maverick. The copper-colored stallion appeared unharmed, his head up and alert as he tested the wind. Even at this distance, Cormac could see the familiar white blaze that marked his horse's face like a lightning bolt. Maverick was pawing at the snow, searching for grass beneath, a good sign that he wasn't injured or overly stressed. Movement near the fire caught Cormac's attention. A figure emerged from the lean-to and through the binoculars. The cowboy got his first clear look at the horse thief. The man was shorter than the boot prints had suggested, maybe 5'8", but built like a prizefighter, with broad shoulders and thick arms revealed by his rolled-up shirt sleeves despite the cold. His hair was steel gray, worn military short, and a carefully trimmed beard covered the lower half of a face marked by old scars. When he moved, it was with the economical grace of someone accustomed to violence. What caught Cormac's eye was the man's left leg. He favored it noticeably, using a walking stick carved from mountain ash to navigate the uneven ground. An old wound, probably military, which explained the distinctive wear pattern in his boot. Prince, the thief Cormac was already thinking of him as Scarface, approached Maverick. With the confidence of an experienced horseman, the stallion allowed him near without shying, accepting a handful of grain with the practical resignation of a horse that understood the situation. No violence, no fear. This man knew how to handle animals. That made him more dangerous, not less. Cormac studied the camp's layout through his glasses, cataloging details with the methodical precision of a man who'd planned his share of dangerous operations. The lean-to was positioned to provide maximum concealment, while offering quick escape routes up the valley walls. A stack of supplies indicated the man had been here before. This wasn't a hastily chosen hiding spot, but a prepared refuge. Near the fire, metal glinted in the afternoon sun. Cormac adjusted his focus and cursed under his breath. Branding irons, 3 of them, their business ends buried in the coals. The rhythmic hammering he'd heard earlier hadn't been metalwork. It had been the sound of the thief preparing to permanently alter Maverick's markings. The cowboy's finger found his rifle's trigger guard as cold rage settled in his chest. Rebranding a stolen horse wasn't just theft, it was destruction of identity, erasing years of partnership and trust. In the unwritten code of the West, it was a violation that demanded personal justice. But as Cormac continued his surveillance, he noticed something that gave him pause. Scarface wasn't acting like a typical horse thief. Instead of immediately beginning the rebranding, he was tending to Maverick with genuine care, checking his hooves, brushing his coat, offering water and grain at regular intervals. The behavior suggested either professional pride or personal attachment, or both. Movement from another direction caught his attention. A second figure emerged from concealment among the rocks. On the valley's eastern slope, a lookout Cormac had missed in his initial survey. This one was younger, lean, and rangy, with the restless energy of a man unaccustomed to waiting. He carried a rifle with the casual familiarity of someone who used it regularly. 2 men, prepared position, clear fields of fire. This wasn't a simple horse theft, it was a military-style operation with discipline and planning behind it. Cormac settled deeper into his hiding spot and began planning his approach. Patience had always been Cormac's greatest weapon, learned through years of hunting both animals and men. As shadows lengthened across the hidden valley, he remained motionless behind his rocky shelter, studying every detail of the camp below. The 2 men, Scarface and his younger partner, maintained a routine that spoke of military training. They alternated watch duties, kept their weapons clean and ready, and communicated through subtle hand signals when movement was necessary. Professional, dangerous, but not invincible. As evening approached, the younger man Cormac had dubbed him Weasel for his quick, nervous movements descended from his lookout position to join Scarface at the fire. They spoke in low voices, their words lost to distance and wind, but their body language told a story of tension and disagreement. Weasel gestured repeatedly toward the branding irons, while Scarface shook his head and pointed at Maverick. The argument escalated until Scarface grabbed his partner's shirt and spoke directly into his face. Whatever he said ended the discussion immediately. Weasel stepped back, his hands raised in surrender. Interesting. There was dissent in the ranks. Using the approaching darkness as cover, Cormac began his descent into the valley. He moved like a ghost through the scattered timber, using every rock and tree to mask his approach. The skills he'd learned stalking Apache raiders in Arizona 30 years ago served him well now, his boots finding silent perches on stone and snow. It took him 2 hours to work his way within 50 yards of the camp, close enough to hear voices, close enough to act, but still hidden in the deep shadows beyond the fire's glow. Maverick sensed his presence first. The stallion's ears pricked forward, nostrils flaring as he caught his owner's familiar scent on the night breeze. "Easy, boy," Cormac breathed, knowing the horse could hear him even if the men could not. Just a little longer. The 2 thieves were sharing a bottle of whiskey now. Their earlier tension dissolved in alcohol, but even drinking, they maintained their weapons close at hand. Scarface's rifle leaned against the rock beside him, while Weasel wore a Colt revolver on his hip. "Should have done it hours ago," Weasel was saying, his words slightly slurred. "Every minute we wait is another minute. That cowboy gets closer." "The horse needs to trust us first," Scarface replied, his voice carrying the authority of command. "You brand a frightened animal, you ruin it. This one's too valuable to destroy with impatience." "Valuable," Weasel laughed harshly. "It's just another stolen horse, Klein. We grab the money and disappear. Same as always, Klein." Now Cormac had a name to go with the scarred face. "This isn't just any horse," Klein said quietly. "This is Cormac Whelan's Mustang. You know who he is." Weasel shook his head, taking another drink. "Whelan tracked down the Baxter gang single-handed after they killed his partner. Found them holed up in a canyon in Colorado and killed all 5 of them. Man's got a reputation for never giving up, never stopping until he gets what he's after." The younger man's face paled in the firelight. "Then why the hell did we take his horse?" "Because we were paid to." The words hit Cormac like a physical blow. This wasn't random theft. Someone had specifically targeted him and Maverick. But who and why? Paid by who? Weasel demanded, apparently sharing Cormac's question. Klein's scarred face hardened. "Questions like that get men killed. We do the job, take the money, and forget we ever saw this valley." Before Weasel could respond, Maverick suddenly threw his head up and whinnied a sound of recognition and welcome that carried clearly through the cold air. Both thieves spun toward the horse, then into the darkness beyond. "We've got company," Klein said calmly, reaching for his rifle. Cormac stepped into the firelight, his Winchester trained on Scarface's chest. "That would be me." The tableau froze for a heartbeat to thieves reaching for weapons, one Cowboy with the drop on them, and a stolen horse dancing with excitement at his owner's appearance. The fire crackled, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "Easy now," Cormac said conversationally. "Klein, isn't it? Why don't you move that hand away from the rifle?" Weasel, "Yes, I know you're thinking about that Colt. Think harder." Klein's scarred features twisted into something that might have been respect. "Whelan should have known you'd find us. Wasn't hard. You left a trail a blind man could follow." Cormac's voice was steady, but his eyes held the cold promise of violence. "Now, you're going to tell me who paid you to steal my horse, and then we're going to discuss how you plan to make this right." Weasel's hand dropped toward his gun. The valley erupted in violence. Weasel's hand had barely touched his Colt's grip when Cormac's Winchester barked, the heavy point for 5 to 70 slugs spinning the younger man sideways into the snow. Not a killing shot. Cormac needed answers more than corpses, but enough to shatter Weasel's gun arm and remove him from the fight. Klein moved simultaneously, diving away from the fire and rolling behind a boulder. His rifle barked twice in quick succession, muzzle flashes strobing in the darkness. Rock chips exploded from the stone beside Cormac's head as he threw himself sideways, working the lever of his Winchester as he fell. "Give it up, Klein," Cormac shouted from behind his own cover. "Your partner's done, and you're outnumbered." A harsh laugh echoed off the valley walls. "Outnumbered? You think I didn't plan for this?" The whistle that split the night air was sharp and piercing, a signal. From 3 different positions around the valley's rim came answering whistles, and Cormac's blood turned to ice. Not 2 men, at least 5, positioned in a perfect crossfire pattern with him caught in the center. Professional didn't begin to describe this operation. Muzzle flashes erupted from the surrounding heights as bullets whined through the camp. Cormac rolled behind a larger boulder, his mind racing through tactical options. The fire provided light for the shooters above while leaving him blind to their positions. Maverick trumpeted in fear, jerking against his tether as lead flew around. "You want your horse to live, Whelan. You'll come out with your hands up." Klein's voice carried clearly through the gunfire. The shooting stopped, leaving only the echo of reports bouncing off stone walls, and Weasel's groans from where he lay clutching his shattered arm. Cormac could hear men moving on the heights, repositioning, improving their angles. Soon they'd have him completely surrounded with no escape route. But something nagged at him about the whole setup. If they'd wanted him dead, the crossfire would have finished him in the first volley. Instead, the shots had been close, but not lethal, meant to pin him down, not kill him. They needed him alive. "Who's paying you, Klein?" Cormac called out. "Must be good money to set up an operation like this." "More than you'd make in 10 lifetimes, Cowboy." Now come out before we decide the horse is worth more than keeping you breathing." Cormac's jaw tightened. The threat to Maverick was real. He could hear the steel in Klein's voice. But surrender meant death, eventually. Men who went to this much trouble to capture someone weren't planning a social visit. Think. What did he know? They'd stolen Maverick specifically, not any horse. They knew his name, his reputation. Someone had paid them well enough to risk a military-style operation in hostile territory. And they wanted him alive. Personal. This was personal. A memory. Surfaced a conversation 3 months ago in a Billings saloon. A drunken man with expensive clothes and a Boston accent, rambling about injustice and revenge. Something about a brother killed in Colorado, a family destroyed. Cormac had been half listening, focused on his whiskey and the poker game in the corner. What was the name? Baxter. The drunk had been going on about the Baxter gang, how they'd been murdered by some cowboy instead of brought to trial. Cormac's blood chilled as the pieces fell into place. 5 years ago, he'd tracked the Baxter gang to their hideout after they'd tortured and killed his partner, Deputy Marshal Tim Crenshaw. The brothers, led by the vicious Clayton Baxter, had been robbing and murdering across 3 territories. When Cormac found them, they'd chosen to fight rather than surrender. He'd given them that choice. "Baxter," he called out. "This is about Clayton Baxter, isn't it?" The silence that followed was answer enough. "Marcus Baxter's your employer," Cormac continued, his voice carrying across the valley. "Rich boy from Boston, Clayton's younger brother. He hired you to bring me in alive so he can have his revenge personally. Smart man." Klein replied, "Marcus wants to look you in the eye when he kills you. Wants you to know that family means something, that you can't just gun down his blood and walk away. Your brother was a murdering snake." Cormac shouted back. He got exactly what he deserved. "That's not for you to decide." The voice came from a different position. Someone else had joined the conversation. Young, educated, with the precise diction of Eastern schooling. Marcus Baxter himself. "Justice belongs in a courtroom, not at the end of a gun." The voice continued. "Clayton may have been lost, but he was still my brother. You executed him without trial, without mercy." Cormac felt a cold smile touch his lips. "Your brother cut off my partner's fingers one by one before he shot him. Tell me about mercy, Baxter." The gunfire that erupted from the heights was wild, angry, emotional rather than tactical. Marcus Baxter had lost his professional composure, and that gave Cormac the opening he needed. The emotional outburst from Marcus Baxter's hired guns created exactly the chaos Cormac had hoped for. Their disciplined crossfire dissolved into wild shooting as anger overrode training. Muzzle flashes blazed from multiple positions, but the shots were high and wide, fury making marksmen sloppy. Cormac used the confusion to sprint toward Maverick, keeping low as bullets whined overhead. The stallion reared and plunged against his tether, eyes rolling white with terror. In one fluid motion, Cormac slashed the rope with his knife and swung onto the horse's back, his Winchester still clutched in his right hand. "Go, boy," he shouted, and Maverick exploded into motion. The Mustang's sure hooves found purchase on the rocky ground as they charged toward the valley's eastern wall. Behind them, Klein's voice rose above the gunfire, trying to restore order to his scattered men. "Don't let him reach the rim. Cut him off." But Maverick was no ordinary horse. Born wild in these mountains, he knew every game trail and hidden path. The stallion stretched into a gallop, weaving between boulders and leaping fallen logs with the fluid grace of running water. Cormac flattened himself against the horse's neck, feeling the familiar rhythm of muscles bunching and extending beneath him. They'd done this before, escape from desperate situations through skill, trust, and the unbreakable bond between man and horse. The difference was that usually they were running from outlaws, not toward them. A rifle cracked from the slopes above, and stone exploded beside Maverick's hooves. The horse never faltered, his ears pinned back as he focused on the treacherous climb ahead. More shots followed, but the shooters were firing downhill in poor light at a moving target, a nearly impossible shot, even for skilled marksmen. Halfway up the eastern slope, Cormac guided Maverick into a narrow ravine carved by centuries of snowmelt. The steep walls provided cover while the rocky bottom muffled their hoof beats. For a few precious minutes, they were invisible to their pursuers at the ravine's head. Cormac dismounted and peered over the rim. The valley spread below like a bowl of shadows, the campfire now a distant spark. He could see movement as men descended from their positions, converging on the spot where he'd disappeared. They'd spread out to search, but in the darkness, they were as blind as he was. Time to even the odds. Cormac pulled his spare ammunition from his saddlebags and checked his Winchester's action. 12 rounds in the magazine, 40 more in his belt. Not enough for a prolonged fight, but sufficient if he chose his targets carefully. "Stay quiet, boy," he whispered to Maverick, stroking the horse's neck. The stallion's breathing was already slowing, his mountain-bred endurance showing. "We're not running anymore." The first target appeared 20 minutes later, a dark figure, moving carefully through the scattered rocks below. Cormac waited until the man was outlined against a patch of snow, then squeezed the trigger. The Winchester's boom echoed off the valley walls, and the figure dropped. Immediately, shouts erupted from multiple positions as the hunters realized they'd become hunted. Muzzle flashes erupted from the darkness, but they were shooting at shadows. Now, Cormac had already moved to a new position 50 yards away. He picked off the second man as he tried to retreat toward the valley's western wall. Another careful shot, another target eliminated. The remaining gunmen were professionals, but they were used to hunting from superior positions with overwhelming firepower. Now they were trapped in a killing ground, with an enemy who knew every inch of the terrain. "Enough," Marcus Baxter's voice cracked with strain as it echoed through the valley. "I want to talk." Cormac said nothing, changing position again. Let them wonder where he was. Let fear do his work for him. "Whelan, I know you can hear me. Let's finish this like civilized men." The cowboy's laugh was harsh and cold. "Your definition of civilized includes hiring killers and stealing horses. We're way past civilized." "Baxter, my brother deserved a trial. Your brother deserved a rope. He got lead instead, more mercy than he showed his victims." A long pause. "Then what do you want?" Cormac considered the question. What did he want? Justice was already served. Clayton Baxter had paid for his crimes 5 years ago. This was about something deeper, older. This was about the fundamental truth that some men chose to be wolves, and other men had to be willing to hunt wolves. "I want you to understand something," Cormac called back. "Your brother wasn't a victim of injustice. He was a rabid dog that needed putting down. The world is safer without him. He was family. Family doesn't excuse murder. It doesn't excuse torture. Blood doesn't wash clean just because you share it." The gunfire that answered was wild and desperate. Marcus Baxter emptying his rifle into the darkness. Cormac tracked the muzzle flashes and put a bullet within inches of the young man's position. Silent. Fell over the valley. The first gray light of dawn found Cormac positioned on a ledge overlooking the valley floor. Maverick ground-tied beside him. Below, 3 bodies lay motionless in the Snokeline's hired guns, eliminated one by one during the long night. The scarred leader himself sat propped against a boulder, clutching a blood-soaked bandana to his shoulder where Cormac's bullet had found its mark. Marcus Baxter knelt beside the wounded man, his expensive Eastern clothes torn and filthy, his face gaunt with exhaustion and defeat. The young man's rifle lay empty in the snow beside him. He'd expended all his ammunition in wild, emotional shooting that had accomplished nothing except to reveal his position. "It's over, Baxter," Cormac called down, his Winchester trained on the pair. "Your men are dead, Klein's wounded, and you're out of ammunition. Time to face the music." Marcus looked up at the sound, his eyes red-rimmed and haunted. "You killed them all. They made their choice when they took my horse. Same choice your brother made 5 years ago." Cormac's voice was steady, matter of fact. "The difference is, I'm giving you a chance he never gave his victims." "What chance?" The young man's voice cracked with exhaustion. "Walk away. Take your wounded friend and disappear. Don't come after me again. Don't hire anyone else to settle your family's debts. Let it end here." Klein stirred against his boulder, fixing Cormac with his scarred face. "And if we refuse?" The cowboy's smile was cold as winter wind. "Then you join your men in the snow. Your choice." Marcus helped Klein to his feet. the wounded man leaning heavily on his makeshift crutch. They moved slowly across the valley floor to broken figures against the white expanse. At the entrance to the canyon that led back towards civilization, Marcus turned back. "This isn't finished, Whelan." "Yes, it is," Cormac replied quietly, though he doubted the young man could hear him at that distance. "It's been finished for 5 years. You just refuse to accept it." He watched until they disappeared among the rocks, then turned his attention. 2 more practical matters. The dead men's horses were picketed near the abandoned camp goods stock that would bring fare. Prices and billings, their weapons and gear represented several $100s in salvage. Blood money, perhaps, but money that would help him through the coming spring. More importantly, their saddlebags contained correspondence that confirmed what Cormac had suspected. Marcus Baxter had been planning this operation for months, tracking Cormac's movements through a network of paid informants and hired watchers. The young man's obsession with avenging his brother had consumed his inheritance and his sanity in equal measure, but it was the final letter that made Cormac pause. A note written in Marcus's own hand, apparently intended for delivery after Cormac's death. In it, the young man detailed his plans to hunt down and kill everyone who had supported the Cowboys. Pursuit of the Baxter gang, Tim Crenshaw's widow, the sheriff who had deputized them, the witnesses who had testified about the gang's crimes. Cormac folded the letter carefully and tucked it into his vest. Evidence, should it ever be needed. But more than that, proof that some obsessions grew like cancer, consuming everything they touched. He saddled Maverick as the sun climbed higher, the familiar ritual of tack and leather soothing after the violence of the night. The stallion stood quietly, occasionally nuzzling his owner's shoulder, a reminder that some bonds couldn't be broken by theft or violence. "Ready to go home, boy?" Cormac asked. Swinging into the saddle, Maverick's ears pricked forward toward the canyon entrance, toward the distant promise of open range and familiar pastures. They left the hidden valley as they had entered it together, unbroken, ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. Behind them, the wind began to cover the tracks and bloodstains with fresh snow, erasing the evidence of the night's violence. By spring, the valley would be clean again, ready for new secrets and new stories. But the most important story was already written in the steady rhythm of hooves on stone. The story of a man and his horse, tested by fire and stronger for the trial. In a land where trust was more valuable than gold, and loyalty meant the difference between life and death, some partnerships were simply unbreakable. As they emerged from the canyon into the broader world, Cormac felt the familiar satisfaction of a job completed and justice served. The Baxter gang's final chapter was closed, their last attempt at revenge turned to ash and memory. Marcus might survive to plot again, but Cormac doubted it. The young man had the look of someone who'd spent everything on a single desperate gamble and lost. The morning sun caught Maverick's copper coat, turning it to burnished gold as they rode toward home. Whatever challenges waited ahead, they would face them together, man and horse, partners in the ancient dance of survival that made legends of the American West. Some bonds, Cormac reflected, were worth fighting for. Some bonds were worth everything.